So here's what I've been thinking about lately. Base classes in 5th edition have a certain amount of power. You can boil this down to a number if you prefer. It is just an easy way to think of class power in relative to each other. So, like on a scale of 1 to 10, we'll say wizard is a 10. And then, say like a cleric or a sorcerer might be around like an 8-ish, all the way down to, say, the very bottom, which is like rogues and barbarians at 1. And this is sort of, it's well known that not all classes are created equal. Different people disagree on exactly where each class falls in this order, but we all know that not all classes are created equal. The martial caster disparity is famous, although I actually think that the gap is much larger than most people realize. Everyone kind of agrees that it's there, if you do any amount of thinking about classes and their relative power to each other. When 5th edition first came out, we were kind of sold on this idea, and to be clear, I don't think Wizards of the Coast ever said anything like this. This came from fans and sort of the initial impressions. But we were sold on this idea that the weaker classes, i.e. the martials, had stronger subclasses to make up for that. That there's you can have a class that's like, a 7 as a base and a 3 as a subclass, adding up to 10, versus a class that's 3 at base and all its subclasses are 7s, and that would also add up to 10 and they would be equal. This was the idea that was sort of bandied about in the D&D communities back in 2014. And I kind of accepted it because it makes sense, doesn't it? It makes sense that that's clearly the way that these are designed. And that's why you have classes like Eldritch Knight for the fighter and Battlemaster, where you get like whole systems of class features, either spells or Battlemaster maneuvers, that these are almost like whole concepts for a class that get added onto the base of a fighter. And so it makes sense, the idea that the fighter's base kit is pretty weak, but its subclasses are so strong that it makes up for it. When in fact, we now can see clearly that that is not the case. And I actually think that it can't really ever be the case because subclasses thus far have been printed so weakly. They haven't accomplished it yet, and therefore, and I've talked about this before, where the community resists fixing the system. Battlemaster is so weak that if you try to buff it, well, it's not even that Battlemaster is so weak. Battlemaster and Eldritch Knight are widely regarded as some of the strongest subclasses for the fighter. Them and Echo Knight, I think, are considered the top 3 subclasses for a fighter. And we're just going to use this as an example. They are head and shoulders above other subclasses. But here's the thing. If you want to have that amount of power, you have to play those subclasses only. Not a champion, not a... I suddenly struggle to think of any other fighter subclasses. They have attempted in the past, I want to say it was in Xanathar's Guide. I think it was in Xanathar's Guide. They printed some new Battlemaster maneuvers to buff up Battlemaster, which is fair because they print new spells in every book. So that buffs up existing classes, but you can't really buff up a fighter as a base. You have to buff up their subclasses because there's no hooks on the base class. They have to create a subclass that has hooks, and then you can hang new mechanics on those hooks. People, I think, as I recall, the community response was that they didn't like it because it's just sort of pushing all fighters towards Battlemaster. And what this means is that if you want to make a fighter subclass and you want to fix the fighter using subclasses, which kind of seemed to be the direction they were going, we're not gonna patch the base classes until the 2024 book, of course. We're not gonna patch the base class. We're going to introduce new subclasses that fix the problems of the class. Well, that kind of invalidates existing subclasses. And I experienced this too, and I experienced a related issue when I was building my, not even when I was building. More recently, some people have seen the Barbarian that I made and notice there's no Zealot Barbarian. Well, Zealot's my favorite subclass, so I'm disappointed that your Barbarian doesn't have the Zealot subclass. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not super familiar with Zealot because I haven't ever used it. So what is it about the Zealot Barbarian that you like? And as it turns out, it's a bunch of stuff that's in the base class. And I realized that the reason why the Zealot Barbarian is as popular as it is because it introduces some functionality to the Barbarian that intuitively feels like it should be baseline. And the fact that it isn't baseline, you have to have a specific subclass in order to get that baseline functionality, or the functionality that you think should be baseline, makes people really like that subclass, because it's now the Barbarian has been moved into the direction that it feels like they ought to be moved. Like, it doesn't make the Barbarian good. I don't think in any way we consider it to be like a fix for Barbarian, but it is one of the best Barbarian subclasses, in part because it's intended to be built like a fix. But that means that you have to play a Zealot Barbarian if you want those fixes, or you have to apply those fixes to every Barbarian subclass. So you're always going to be either incomplete, or you are or you end up going and patching the class in the first place, or anyways, which is something that sort of this patch by subclass idea was supposed to avoid. So I don't think that you can fix base classes with subclasses, despite the fact that I think as amateur designers should try. If you're making 5e content, especially if you're making subclasses for martial classes, you got to understand that you have such a high ceiling. Like the ceiling is basically unreachable. You can go completely hog wild on your designs, and you're not going to catch up to even like the mid-tier classes like Warlock. Like, I think Warlock is probably a pretty good benchmark for aiming as far as balance is considered. If you're making a new class, like, that should be your goal. Like, make it reasonably about as good as a Warlock. Because I consider Warlocks to be B tier, which is good but not great. Like, it doesn't keep up with actual full casters, but it tries. It has a spot. And so if you are creating content for martials, that's kind of your goal, but you've got so much distance to get there that you have to do a lot of work to like make up that difference. So what you end up with is a subclass that is far and away better than existing subclasses. And so people will see that and say, well, this is clearly busted. No, the game is busted. The game has started busted. The game was printed busted. What we are trying to do is put a bridge over some of these gaps. But the bridges have to be long because the gaps are also wide. And so this sort of relates back to my video about how the community resists fixing the game, because the content that you have to print in order to bridge some of these gaps is so ridiculous. But what people see is that, oh, well, that is clearly a ridiculous power spike. What they don't see is that it's a power spike to compensate for the lack of this ability over here, which is in the game, but is also ridiculous. Like, however ridiculous you think this bridge is, the gap is that ridiculous. But they don't see it that way. And so what you end up with is you have to kind of choose between, do you want wide acceptance for printing something that aligns with the status quo, or do you want to actually make a design that fixes the problem that you're there to fix? But even then, if you make a subclass that fixes all the problems with whatever class you're designing for, let's say Rogue, Rogue has a few problems. It's what? Low damage, no options, because it's a martial, so it doesn't really get like active abilities. And it's pretty flimsy. Like, it has a lot of active defensive abilities, but it doesn't, like, if any of those fall through, you just have nothing to fall back on. So let's say you make a subclass that fixes all those things. you're now dealing good damage. You have a lot of different options. Maybe you cast spells, or you maybe come up with a whole maneuver system. That's what I did with my rogue. I created a new maneuver system called Rogue Tricks. You have defensive abilities that make you actually hard to take out of a fight. Even if you do all that, if you're doing it with a subclass, one, that's gonna be a bloated subclass. Like that's certainly something to factor in. Your complexity budget is not infinite. So you have to sort of pack a lot of power into relatively few features, which is difficult to do. But even if you accomplish that, now, if you want a rogue that keeps up with the power level that you have decided is good for your game, whether that's, about even with a warlock, about even with a cleric, or what have you, that's the only rogue subclass that exists functionally, because all the other ones are F tier, because a rogue is an F tier class. I get downvoted every time I say that. I talk about martials sometimes on Reddit, and every time I say, well, this is a garbage tier class, it's like, downvotes, we don't like you to say that our class is bad, even though I am actively, campaigning for improvements. And you have to acknowledge that the class is bad in order to justify improving it. No, can't do that. Can't do that ever. Can never say something is bad in D&D. Never, ever. But yeah, so there's a few different reasons that all exist independently, but they also connect to each other about why you can't use subclasses to fix bad classes. And I think attempting to do so is kind of a waste of effort. But I understand why the impulse to attempt to do so exists. It's sort of a romantic idea that this can be a thing that happens, but the game is just not set up for it and never will be.